Personal grudges once altered the borders of the world. The fate of entire civilizations often hung on the bitter rivalries between a handful of rulers. From the deserts of Egypt to the forums of Rome, ancient history is a story of clashing ambitions that decided who would rule and who would be forgotten. By the end of this journey, you will understand the 22 rivalries that fundamentally shaped the ancient world's greatest power struggles. We will uncover how a single betrayal could collapse a dynasty and why a battle lost to propaganda was sometimes more important than one won on the field. What does it truly take for one person to challenge an empire? The battlefield was only the most visible stage for these epic confrontations. A true ancient rivalry was a multidimensional war fought in shadow as much as in sunlight. It was a high-stakes chess match where the pieces were not just armies, but also spies, gold, marriages, and ideas. A king could lose his throne not from a sword wound, but from a perfectly timed rumor or a poisoned cup from a trusted advisor. These struggles were deeply personal engines of history, driven by perceived slights and an obsession with how one's name would echo through the ages. An insult delivered at a banquet could fester for years, blossoming into a vendetta that toppled dynasties. This is why a single defeat could be so catastrophic. It was not merely a lost battle. It was the potential annihilation of a culture's memory, its gods, its very language, systematically erased by the victor. To understand the 22 rivalries that forged the ancient world, we must look past the clashing spears and into the minds of the rulers themselves, into the private ambitions and bitter hatreds that redrew the map of civilization. The sun beat down on the plains of Kadesh, baking the earth where two colossi of the Bronze Age prepared to clash. For the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, this was not merely a battle, it was a contest for the very lifeblood of their empires, the rich trade routes of Syria. Rameses marched north with a massive army, his divisions stretching for miles, confident in his divine right to rule. But Muwatalli was a master of deception, hiding the bulk of his own formidable force, including thousands of chariots behind the ancient city. When the Egyptians captured two Hittite scouts, they revealed a terrifying truth. Rameses and his advance guard were not the hunters, but the prey, isolated and moments away from being surrounded. What followed was a chaos of dust and bronze, a frantic struggle for survival as Hittite chariots smashed into the Egyptian camp. Yet the true battle was only beginning, a fight not for the field but for history itself. Despite being tactically outmaneuvered and nearly captured, Rameses returned to Egypt and proclaimed a magnificent victory. The walls of his temples at Karnak and Abu Simbel were carved with breathtaking scenes showing him alone, a god-king single-handedly smashing the Hittite hordes. This was a masterpiece of ancient propaganda, a narrative designed to turn a near disaster into a legend of personal valor and divine favor. The actual outcome was likely a bloody stalemate, but Rameses understood that controlling the story was as important as winning the fight. So why, after such a grand claim of victory, would this powerful pharaoh ever seek peace with his humbled rival? The answer lies in a document of astonishing practicality. After years of a costly Cold War, both empires realized that total conquest was impossible. The result was one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, a peace treaty between Rameses II and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III. Inscribed on silver tablets, this agreement pledged eternal brotherhood and mutual assistance. It promised that if either empire was attacked by a third party, or if internal rebellions threatened their thrones, the other would send military aid. They even established formal extradition for political fugitives. This was not a victor imposing terms on the vanquished. It was a strategic partnership between equals, an acknowledgement that some rivalries are better resolved at the negotiating table than on the battlefield. This treaty, one of the oldest surviving in human history, secured a peace that lasted for generations, proving that the most enduring legacy of a power struggle is sometimes not the glory of war, but the wisdom of a shared peace. Centuries before Rameses and the Hittites, in the fertile land between two rivers, a rivalry ignited that would invent the very concept of an empire. The established order was personified by Lugaltsagesi, the king of Uruk, who had painstakingly united the proud, independent city-states of Sumer under his leadership. For a generation, he was the dominant power in Mesopotamia, the guardian of an ancient system. But a new vision was rising to challenge him, a vision not of a league of cities, but of a single, centralized state. That vision belonged to a man named Sargon. His origins were shrouded in a legend that spoke of his improbable rise, a story of a baby set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River, found and raised by a gardener who would eventually become the cupbearer to the king of the city of Kish. From this humble position of service, Sargon saw the limitations of the old ways, and he dreamed of something far grander. He did not just want to rule Sumer. He wanted to erase its old borders and create something the world had never seen. Sargon's audacity was matched by his military innovation. He assembled a professional standing army, loyal not to a city but to him personally. This was a revolutionary force, a tool designed not for seasonal raids but for permanent conquest. When he finally marched against Lugaltsagesi, it was more than a war between two kings. It was a clash of ideologies. The established confederacy of Sumer faced a new, unified war machine. The decisive battles were brutal and conclusive. Sargon's forces triumphed, and to cement his victory, he did something shockingly cruel and strategically brilliant. He did not just execute his rival. Chronicles tell us he paraded Lugaltsagesi in a neckstock through the gates of the holy city of Nippur, a profound humiliation designed to break the spirit of the old order. But his most lasting tactic was the systematic uprooting of entire populations from their ancestral cities, scattering them across his new domain. This was psychological warfare on a massive scale, designed to shatter regional loyalties and ensure that people's primary identity was no longer as citizens of Ur or Uruk, but as subjects of Akkad. This first great confrontation set a terrifying precedent. Sargon proved that with sheer audacity and a new model of power, one man could topple an ancient political landscape and redraw it according to his own will. His victory over Lugaltsagesi did not just found the world's first true empire. It established a brutal blueprint that every future empire builder, from the Assyrians to the Romans, would study and emulate. The very idea of conquering diverse peoples and binding them into a single, centralized state was born from this rivalry. But such a monumental shift in power could not go unchallenged for long. What happens when the blueprint for empire falls into the hands of a ruler whose ambition is matched only by her political genius? The blueprint for empire Sargon forged would be tested again and again. But no rivalry would ever encapsulate a clash of ideals more perfectly than the one that tore ancient Greece apart. This was the Peloponnesian War, a 30-year struggle that pitted the radiant, democratic, and seafaring Athens against the austere, oligarchic, and land-locked Sparta. It was a conflict between two irreconcilable visions of a good life. On one side stood Athens, a city of philosophers and playwrights, its wealth and influence built upon a vast fleet that connected a maritime empire. Its guiding spirit was the statesman Pericles, who urged his citizens to become the school of all Greece, to value beauty and wisdom alongside military might. Arrayed against this was Sparta, a society organized as a permanent military camp. From childhood, its citizens were forged into the most feared hoplites in the world, their lives dedicated to discipline, austerity, and the supremacy of the state over the individual. This was not just a fight over territory, but a fundamental argument about how society should be structured. Pericles' initial strategy was a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare. Knowing the Spartan army was invincible in open battle, he refused to meet it. He pulled the entire rural population of Attica behind the massive long walls that connected Athens to its port, creating an impregnable fortified corridor. The city would be fed by its fleet while its navy raided the Spartan coast and strangled its allies' trade. For a time, this worked, but then a devastating plague swept through the overcrowded city, killing a third of the population, including Pericles himself. With its visionary leader gone, Athens descended into a more reckless and brutal phase of the war. This shift in temperament culminated in one of history's most catastrophic military blunders, the Sicilian expedition. Persuaded by the ambitious Alcibiades, Athens launched a massive armada to conquer the distant, wealthy city of Syracuse. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, a bid for total hegemony that overstretched their power to a breaking point. The campaign was a cascade of poor decisions and missed opportunities. Alcibiades, recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege, defected to Sparta. The Athenian forces, now leaderless and confused, found themselves trapped in the great harbor of Syracuse. Their entire fleet was destroyed, and their retreating army was systematically annihilated. Tens of thousands of Athenians died in the quarries of Syracuse, sold into slavery or left to perish. The city's power and prestige were shattered in a single, disastrous stroke. Yet even then, Athens fought on for another decade, its resilience a testament to its underlying strength. The war ground down, becoming ever more vicious, with massacres and betrayals becoming commonplace. The final architect of Athenian defeat was the Spartan commander Lysander, a man who understood that to break a naval power, you must first break its treasury. With vast sums of gold supplied by their new ally, the Persian Empire, Lysander built a new fleet and expertly challenged Athens at its own game. The end came not with a dramatic assault on the city itself, but with a quiet, decisive naval battle at Aegospotami. Lysander surprised the Athenian fleet while it was beached and unprepared, capturing almost every single ship. He then executed 3,000 Athenian prisoners, a chilling message of the new, ruthless Spartan policy. With its navy gone and its food supply severed, Athens was starved into submission. The long walls, the symbol of its maritime strategy and its defiance, were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. The city that had championed democracy and free thought was now forced to submit to a brutal, pro-Spartan oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. The Peloponnesian War did not have a single victor so much as it had a clear loser, Greece itself. The generations of bloodshed had exhausted the entire Hellenic world, draining its wealth and fracturing its unity. The golden age of Greek civilization was over, its brilliant light dimmed by internal hatred. And as the city-states continued to war amongst themselves, a new power was gathering strength in the north, a kingdom that had been watching, learning, and waiting for its moment to unite all of Greece under a single iron will. The golden sands of Lydia held a king whose name became a synonym for wealth itself, Croesus. His kingdom, rich from the gold of the river Pactolus, stood as the pinnacle of Anatolian power, a fortress of commerce and tradition. But from the east came a storm that valued conquest over coin, a visionary named Cyrus. He was not merely a king, he was the architect of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, a man who believed his destiny was to unite the world under a new, tolerant order. When Cyrus set his sights on Lydia, it was more than a war between two rulers. It was a collision between an old world of accumulated treasure and a new world of unstoppable ambition. Croesus, confident in his wealth and his legendary alliance with the oracles of Greece, marched out to meet the Persian threat. He trusted in his superb cavalry, the finest in the known world, to crush this upstart. But Cyrus was a master of the unexpected. At the decisive Battle of Thymbra, he unveiled a terrifying and brilliant innovation. He positioned his baggage train camels at the front of his lines. The unfamiliar sight and overwhelming smell of these strange animals spooked the Lydian horses, throwing their magnificent cavalry charge into disarray before a single spear was thrown. It was a psychological masterstroke that neutralized Croesus' greatest advantage, allowing the Persian infantry to envelop and destroy the confused Lydian army. The legends say Croesus, defeated and captured, was placed upon a funeral pyre. As the flames rose, he reportedly called out the name of the Greek sage Solon, finally understanding the warning that no man could be called happy until his life was over. In some versions of the tale, a miraculous rain extinguished the flames, and Cyrus, moved by this divine intervention or perhaps by simple political wisdom, spared his rival's life. But Cyrus's true genius was revealed not in the battle nor in the sparing of a king, but in what came after. He did not sack and enslave Lydia. Instead, he absorbed it. His policy of tolerance, a radical concept for its time, allowed the Lydians to keep their customs, their gods, and their way of life. They only had to acknowledge Persian rule. This was the secret to his empire's rapid growth. Cyrus understood that an empire built on consent was far more stable than one held together by fear alone. The fall of Croesus was a pivot point in history, a clear signal that sheer wealth was no longer enough to guarantee power. The center of gravity was shifting irrevocably from the wealthy kingdoms of Anatolia to the dynamic, expansive empire of Persia. It proved that the future belonged not to those who hoarded gold, but to those who mastered new forms of warfare and a new philosophy of rule. Yet this vast Persian empire, the greatest the world had yet seen, would soon face its own ultimate test. A challenge would come not from a wealthy king, but from a handful of fractious Greek city-states and two rival commanders whose bitter disagreement would nearly cost them everything. The Mediterranean became the stage for a final, brutal lesson in ancient rivalry. For over a century, the rising Roman Republic and the established mercantile empire of Carthage were locked in a death struggle, a series of 3 conflicts so total they would define the very meaning of victory and defeat. This was not a clash over a single city or a disputed border. It was a fight for the soul of the sea itself, a contest to decide which civilization would dictate the future of the Western world. The First Punic War was a grueling naval marathon, a 23-year slugfest where Rome, a land power with little maritime experience, audaciously decided to build a fleet from scratch and challenge Carthage on its own element. They lost entire armadas to storms and skilled Carthaginian admirals, yet they stubbornly rebuilt, refusing to yield. Their eventual victory forced Carthage to surrender Sicily and pay a massive indemnity, but it only planted the seeds for an even more terrible revenge. That revenge would be personified by a single man, a military genius whose name would haunt Rome for generations, Hannibal Barca. After Rome provoked a second war, Hannibal embarked on one of the most daring campaigns in military history. He marched his army, including dozens of war elephants from Iberia, across the treacherous peaks of the Alps and into the Italian heartland itself. His strategic masterpiece at Cannae is still studied today. There, he surrounded and annihilated a Roman army more than twice the size of his own, killing perhaps 50,000 men in a single afternoon. For 16 years, Hannibal operated undefeated on Italian soil, a ghost that terrorized the Republic, proving that no Roman army could defeat him in open battle. Yet he could not capture Rome itself, and his pleas for reinforcements from a cautious Carthaginian Senate went unanswered. The war's ultimate architect was not Hannibal, but the Roman who finally understood how to defeat him, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. While Hannibal was trapped in Italy, Scipio took the fight to Carthage's backyard in North Africa. By threatening their capital, he forced Hannibal to return home for a final, decisive confrontation. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio did not try to outmaneuver Hannibal's envelopment tactics. Instead, he created a new formation with wide lanes that absorbed the charge of Carthaginian war elephants, neutralizing them completely. The Roman infantry then pressed forward, and Scipio's superior cavalry, secured through alliances, returned to smash into the Carthaginian rear. It was a flawless execution of Hannibal's own favorite strategy, used against him. Hannibal was defeated, and Carthage was forced to surrender its fleet, its foreign possessions, and its status as a great power. But for Rome, this was not enough. The memory of Hannibal at their gates festered for decades, a paranoia that demanded a final, terrible solution. An elderly senator, Cotto the Elder, ended every speech he gave, regardless of the topic, with the same stark phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. In the Third Punic War, Rome found a flimsy pretext to besiege a city that was no longer a true threat. After a 3-year siege, the legions finally broke through. They systematically burned Carthage to the ground, plowed salt into its fields to symbolize its eternal ruin, and sold its surviving population into slavery. The destruction was so complete that the city itself was erased from the map. The Punic Wars forged the Roman legions into an unstoppable instrument of imperial ambition. More importantly, they established a terrifying new standard for total war. Rome had learned that for its own survival, a rival civilization must not just be defeated, but utterly eradicated, its memory scorched from the earth. This doctrine of annihilation would echo through the centuries, but it also created a power vacuum that would one day threaten the Republic from within. As Rome's territory expanded, so did the wealth and influence of its most successful generals, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict, one where the greatest rivals would not be foreign kings, but Romans themselves. The Roman doctrine of annihilation left a legacy of absolute victory, but it was a lesson another young conqueror would study with obsessive intensity. For Alexander III of Macedon, the sprawling Persian Empire was not just a prize. It was an inheritance he believed was stolen, a personal grudge rooted in the ancient invasions of Greece by Persian kings like Xerxes. His campaign against the Persian Emperor Darius III was framed as a righteous crusade of vengeance, but it was, in truth, a collision between two irreconcilable concepts of kingship. Darius ruled a vast administrative state, the pinnacle of ancient centralized power. Alexander led a personal weapon, a compact and loyal army honed by his father, Philip, into a perfectly balanced combined arms force. Their first major confrontation at Issus revealed the core weakness of the Persian system. Alexander, though outnumbered, forced the battle in a narrow coastal plain where Darius could not leverage his overwhelming numbers. The Macedonian phalanx, a bristling wall of 18-foot spears, pinned the Persian center. Then Alexander himself led his elite companion cavalry in a devastating charge aimed directly at the Persian emperor. It was a shock tactic, a decapitation strike. The sight of the Macedonian king crashing toward his position shattered Darius's nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the field, abandoning his army, his family, and his royal treasure. This single act of personal cowardice, while saving his own life, critically wounded his authority. Alexander now held the Persian queen mother, the wife, and the children of Darius. Yet, in a move of brilliant political theater, he treated them with royal dignity. He was not merely a barbarian invader. He was positioning himself as the magnanimous successor, the rightful king of Asia. But Darius was not yet finished. He withdrew into the heart of his empire, buying time to raise a truly colossal army for a final, definitive battle. The plain of Gaugamela was chosen specifically for its open terrain, a perfect stage for his numerical advantage and his most potent weapon, 200 scythed chariots designed to mow down infantry lines. Darius had the ground cleared to ensure his chariots could charge unimpeded. He held every conceivable tactical advantage. Alexander, facing insurmountable odds, did the one thing his enemy least expected. He did not fortify a position. Instead, he advanced obliquely, his entire battle line drifting to the right, stretching the Persian left flank to its breaking point. This deliberate, creeping movement was a masterful feint. It forced Darius to commit his reserves and begin enveloping the Macedonian right. And in that moment, as the Persian line thinned and a gap inevitably appeared between their center and their overextended left, Alexander struck. He formed his companion cavalry into a deadly wedge and drove it directly into that seam, a surgical thrust aimed once again at the heart of the Persian command. The companion cavalry shattered the Persian guard, and Alexander himself nearly reached Darius for a second time. The emperor's nerve broke again. His flight from Gaugamela was the death knell for his empire. The battle was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and tactical precision, proving that a smaller, disciplined force led by a genius could dismantle a Leviathan. But Alexander was not content with a battlefield victory. The rivalry had become a personal obsession. He embarked on a relentless pursuit, chasing the ghost of Darius across thousands of miles through the Persian capitals of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, which he famously burned. The hunt ended not with a climactic duel, but with betrayal. Darius was found mortally wounded in his chariot, murdered by his own satraps who saw him as a liability. Alexander, upon finding the body of his rival, covered him with his own cloak and gave him a royal funeral. It was the final, symbolic act in the transfer of power. He had not just defeated Darius, he had replaced him. This rivalry did more than topple a dynasty. It fused the cultures of Greece and the East, creating the Hellenistic world that would serve as the cradle for Rome's own rise. Alexander's conquests redrew the map of the known world, but such a vast personal empire could not survive its creator. The vacuum of power left by his early death would ignite a different kind of struggle, one not between kings, but between his own former generals, each fighting to carve their own kingdom from the fragments of his dream. Alexander's vast empire, a tapestry of cultures stitched together by sheer force of will, began to unravel the moment his breath stilled. With no clear successor strong enough to hold his conquests, the inheritance was not a crown but a vacuum, and into that void stepped his generals, the Diadochi. These were not mere officers, they were titans who had marched at Alexander's side, learned his tactics, and now hungered for kingdoms of their own. What followed was not a single war, but a sprawling 40-year, long storm of betrayal and ambition that raged from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan. The bonds of camaraderie forged on campaigns shattered almost instantly, replaced by a complex web of shifting alliances and personal vendettas. Ptolemy secured the wealthy prize of Egypt, a land he could defend behind its natural moats of sea and desert. Seleucus fought doggedly for the sprawling eastern satrapies, the heart of the old Persian Empire. In Asia Minor and Greece, the one-eyed Antigonus and his son Demetrius dreamed of reuniting the entire empire under their own rule, while Cassander seized Macedonia and ruthlessly eliminated Alexander's bloodline to secure his own claim. This was not a conflict of ideologies or nations. It was a brutal free-for-all, a chess game played with real armies across 3 continents, where the prize was the legacy of a god-king. The battles were colossal, the betrayals breathtaking. Alliances formed at a wedding feast could be broken by assassination before the next sunrise. At the Battle of Ipsus, the final hope for a unified empire died. The aging Antigonus, believing victory was within his grasp, faced a coalition of every other major diadochi. The decisive factor was not infantry or cavalry, but a weapon Antigonus had fatally dismissed: war elephants. Seleucus, having secured 500 of the beasts from an Indian king, used them to screen his movements and block the charge of Antigonus's son, Demetrius. Isolated and surrounded, Antigonus fought on until he was struck down by a volley of javelins. His death marked the end of an era. The dream of one empire was gone forever, permanently fractured into a new political map. From the ashes of this 40-year struggle rose the Hellenistic kingdoms that would define the next 3 centuries: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia. They became centers of learning and culture, but their very existence was a testament to a failure of succession. The diadochi proved that an empire built on the genius of one man cannot survive him. They dismantled a world state not for a grand cause, but for personal glory, demonstrating how quickly unity can dissolve into a chaos of rival ambitions. And in the shadow of their new capitals, a new power was slowly learning from their mistakes, a republic that would one day master the art of succession and turn all their kingdoms into mere provinces. The Roman Republic was dying, and its final crisis would be a duel between 2 men who had once been allies, even family. Julius Caesar, the populist general whose conquest of Gaul had given him an army of fanatically loyal veterans, stood against Pompey Magnus, the Senate's champion, a man hailed in his youth as the greatest commander of his generation. For centuries, the unwritten rules of the Republic had prevented such a direct confrontation, balancing ambition with tradition. But that delicate balance was shattered when the Senate, fearing Caesar's rising power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey meant political annihilation, and Caesar was not a man who accepted annihilation. The moment of decision came at a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. By leading a legion across this boundary, Caesar was no longer a provincial governor. He was a rebel, an enemy of the state. He understood the gravity of the act, reportedly saying, "The die is cast." This was not just a military maneuver. It was a declaration that the will of one man and his legions now outweighed the collective authority of the Senate and the Roman people. Pompey and the conservative faction of the Senate fled Rome, scrambling to raise an army in Greece. They believed their cause was just and their resources vast, but they underestimated the speed of Caesar's advance and the loyalty of his battle-hardened legions. For months, the 2 forces shadowed each other across Greece, a tense stalemate broken by supply shortages and failed skirmishes. The final, decisive confrontation came on the plains of Pharsalus. Pompey's army was significantly larger, his cavalry superior. His advisors urged him to use his numerical advantage to envelop Caesar's flank, a sound, traditional tactic. But Caesar, a master of reading the battlefield, anticipated this very move. He secretly pulled cohorts from his rear lines to form a 4th line of infantry, hiding them behind his main force. When Pompey's cavalry charged, routing Caesar's outnumbered horsemen, they believed victory was at hand. Then Caesar gave the signal. His hidden reserve line surged forward, not throwing their javelins but using them as thrusting spears, aiming for the faces of the enemy cavalry, a terrifying and unfamiliar tactic. The charge broke completely. The elite horsemen, expecting a routed foe, were shocked by this ferocious counter-assault and fled in panic. With their cavalry gone, Pompey's left flank was exposed. Caesar's veterans enveloped the enemy and crushed them. The battle was a masterclass in tactical innovation, overcoming traditional superiority. Pompey, watching his grand army disintegrate, reportedly murmured, "They have beaten me," and fled the field. His flight took him to Egypt, a kingdom nominally allied to Rome, where he sought refuge with the young king Ptolemy XIII. But Ptolemy's advisors, seeking to curry favor with the victorious Caesar, made a cold-blooded calculation. As Pompey stepped ashore, they murdered him, stabbing the man who had once been called the Great to death on an Egyptian beach. They presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Instead of gratitude, Caesar was reportedly disgusted. The death of his great rival in such a sordid and treacherous manner marked the final, ugly end of the old political game. The personal feud between Caesar and Pompey did more than decide who would rule Rome. It shattered the very foundation of the Republic, proving conclusively that political power now grew from the point of a legionary's sword. The centuries-old tradition of shared governance was dead, replaced by the raw ambition of military strongmen. This rivalry opened the door to the imperial system, establishing a precedent that would lead to more civil wars, the rise of Augustus, and the birth of the Roman Empire. The crossing of the Rubicon was a point of no return, not just for Caesar, but for the entire Western world. The final struggle between Caesar and Pompey had sealed the fate of the Republic, but the blueprint for such destructive civil wars was perfected centuries earlier in the East. Long before Roman legions turned on each other, the two most powerful fragments of Alexander's empire, the Seleucid dynasty in the East and the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, were locked in their own endless, grinding conflict. For over a century, their focus was fixed on a single, coveted prize, the region of Syria. This was not just a strip of land, it was the economic lung of the region, controlling the vital trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world to the riches of Arabia and Mesopotamia. For the Ptolemies, it was an essential buffer zone protecting their wealthy Egyptian heartland. For the Seleucids, it was a core territory, a gateway to the sea that their empire desperately needed. This dispute ignited a series of 6 brutal conflicts known collectively as the Syrian Wars, a cycle of attack and counterattack that became a defining feature of the Hellenistic Age. The fourth of these wars culminated in the colossal Battle of Raphia. The Seleucid king, Antiochus III, later known as Antiochus the Great, marched south with a massive army, confident of reclaiming the territory for his empire. Facing him was the young pharaoh Ptolemy IV. Drastically outnumbered in traditional Greek and Macedonian troops, Ptolemy and his advisors made a radical, unprecedented decision. They armed 20,000 native Egyptian warriors, training them to fight in the phalanx formation. This was a profound gamble. For a century, the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic elite had deliberately excluded the native population from the military, fearing that training them to fight might one day lead to rebellion. But at Raphia, the desperate need for manpower overrode this deep-seated political fear. When the two phalanxes, one Seleucid and one Ptolemaic, slammed into each other, the battle was a brutal stalemate. But on the wings, Ptolemy's new Egyptian phalanx held firm against the Seleucid infantry, while his war elephants, though outmatched by the larger Indian elephants of Antiochus, created enough disruption. Ptolemy himself led a cavalry charge that turned the tide, forcing Antiochus to retreat. The victory secured Ptolemaic control of Syria, but the long-term consequences were far more significant than anyone at the time could have guessed. By arming and training the native Egyptians, the Ptolemies had inadvertently awakened a powerful national consciousness. The very rebellion they had feared for so long soon erupted, draining the kingdom's resources for decades. The rivalry continued, a seemingly endless pendulum swing of territorial gains and losses. Alliances shifted with the wind, as neighboring kingdoms and even rising republics like Rome were drawn into the diplomatic game, playing one Hellenistic power against the other. The constant warfare bled both empires dry, consuming their treasuries and diverting their attention inward. They failed to notice the new powers gathering strength on their peripheries. In the West, Rome was systematically dismantling every major state in the Mediterranean. In the East, the Parthians were steadily chipping away at the vulnerable eastern provinces of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids and Ptolemies were so consumed with their ancient feud over a single strip of land that they did not see the larger trap closing around them. Their prolonged struggle is a timeless lesson in strategic myopia. When two giants become fixated on their mutual hatred, they often fail to see the world changing around them, creating a vacuum of power that new rivals are all too eager to fill. While the Ptolemies and Seleucids were locked in their distant struggle, the future masters of the Mediterranean were fighting for their very survival much closer to home. The rugged spine of Italy, the Apennine Mountains, was the domain of the Samnites, a confederation of hardy, warlike tribes. For the rising Roman Republic, these highlanders were not a distant annoyance but a barrier to its own destiny. Control of the Italian peninsula was the essential first step, and the Samnites stood directly in the way, leading to three of the most brutal and formative wars in Rome's early history. The first two conflicts were bloody affairs of raid and counter-raid, but it was the second war that delivered a lesson in humility Rome would never forget. Lured into a narrow mountain pass known as the Caudine Forks, two entire Roman legions found themselves trapped. There was no escape. With no choice but surrender, the Roman soldiers were forced to pass under a yoke of spears, a ritual of supreme shame that symbolically stripped them of their manhood and their honor. This was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological scar that seared itself into the Roman soul. Yet, instead of breaking their spirit, this humiliation became their greatest teacher. The Romans were forced to confront the limitations of their rigid, phalanx-based army, a formation that was utterly useless in the broken, mountainous terrain of Samnium. Their response was a military revolution. They abandoned the old Greek model and developed the Manipular Legion, a flexible system built around small, mobile units called maniples. Each maniple could operate independently, flowing over hills and through forests like water, a stark contrast to the unwieldy phalanx. This new legion was also equipped with a new weapon, the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact, rendering an enemy's shield useless before the short sword did its work. The final Samnite War was a test of this new military machine, and it proved devastatingly effective. The Samnites, realizing they were now facing a completely different army, formed a grand coalition with other Italian peoples, including the Etruscans and Umbrians, in a last, desperate attempt to crush Rome. The Battle of Sentinum was the epic, final confrontation. The Romans, though outnumbered, used their new manipular flexibility to hold the line against a ferocious Samnite assault on one flank, while their cavalry secured a decisive victory on the other. It was a hard-fought triumph, but it broke the back of the coalition. The Samnites were gradually subdued, their land absorbed, their people bound to Rome by a network of treaties and colonies. This grueling rivalry was the crucible that forged the Roman legions, the very tools that would later carve out an empire from Spain to Syria. the manipular system, the pilum, and the tactical adaptability were all born from the hard lessons learned in the Samnite mountains. It proved that a defeat absorbed and learned from can be far more valuable than an easy victory. The struggle for Italy taught Rome how to lose, how to adapt, and ultimately how to conquer. But mastering the Italian peninsula was only the beginning. As Rome's influence grew, its gaze would inevitably turn across the sea, where a much older, wealthier civilization was waiting, setting the stage for the greatest rivalry of the ancient world. Even the mighty Persian Empire, a state that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, was not immune to the poison of a family feud. At its heart lay a bitter rivalry between two brothers, King Artaxerxes II and his ambitious younger sibling, Cyrus. Artaxerxes had inherited the throne, the title of King of Kings, but Cyrus believed he was the more worthy ruler. As the satrap or governor of the wealthy coastal provinces, Cyrus spent years building a power base, secretly assembling an army under the guise of local campaigns. His most crucial recruits were not Persians, however, but 10,000 hardened Greek hoplites, professional soldiers whose long spears and disciplined phalanx formation made them the most formidable infantry in the world. Cyrus lured them deep into the heart of Mesopotamia with promises of rich rewards, all while carefully hiding his true target, his own brother, the great king. The two forces finally met on the dusty plain of Cunaxa, north of Babylon. The battle was a chaotic swirl of dust and shouting men. Cyrus, seeing his brother directing the Persian army from the center, made a desperate, audacious gamble. He charged directly at Artaxerxes with his personal cavalry, a small band of nobles aiming for a single, decisive kill. In the frantic melee, Cyrus himself struck the king, wounding him in the chest. But in the next moment, a javelin caught Cyrus in the eye, killing him instantly. His death, not a lost battle, was the end of the rebellion. The Greek mercenaries, however, had held their ground against the Persian left wing. They were undefeated, but their employer was dead, their cause was lost, and they were now stranded over 1,000 miles from the sea, deep inside a hostile empire surrounded by enemies. This is where the story transforms from a failed coup into one of history's greatest survival epics. The Greek generals were promptly invited to a peace conference by the Persian satrap Tisiphons, a supposed truce to discuss their safe passage home. It was a trap. The Persian commander seized and executed the Greek leadership, leaving the 10,000 leaderless, isolated, and seemingly doomed. At this moment of absolute despair, a young Athenian cavalry officer named Xenophon stepped forward. He had accompanied the expedition as an observer, but now he rallied the despondent soldiers. He convinced them that their discipline and their spears were their only way home, and that they should not beg for a treaty but fight for their freedom. What followed was the legendary March of the 10,000, an epic fighting retreat through unknown and hostile territories. They marched north through the deserts of Mesopotamia, fought their way through the snowy mountain passes of Kurdistan and Armenia, constantly harassed by local tribes and Persian forces. Xenophon's leadership and the Greeks' unbreakable formation turned them into a moving fortress. They were a demonstration of profound Persian weakness, a small, disciplined army marching with impunity through the very heart of the empire, defeating every force sent to stop them. When the survivors finally caught sight of the Black Sea, shouting, the sea," their salvation was at hand. Xenophon's account of the journey, his Anabosses, became a Greek bestseller. It provided an intimate, revealing look behind the glittering facade of Persian power. It showed the world that the empire, for all its vast size and wealth, was politically fragile, its outer provinces often in rebellion, and its military reliant on numbers and cavalry, unable to stand against a determined corps of heavy infantry. The fraternal war between Artaxerxes and Cyrus did more than just claim a prince's life. It exposed a critical vulnerability, a lesson that would not be forgotten by a future king from a small mountainous kingdom to the north, a young man named Alexander who would study Xenophon's account and see a roadmap for conquest. Antigonus the One-Eyed saw himself as the only true heir to Alexander's legacy. While his fellow generals carved out their separate kingdoms, he alone harbored the grand, almost anachronistic dream of stitching the entire empire back together. From his power base in Asia Minor, he and his brilliant son Demetrius Poliorcetes campaigned relentlessly, their ambition a clear threat to every other successor king. Cassander in Macedon, Lysimachus in Thrace, Ptolemy in Egypt, and the recently returned Seleucus from the eastern satrapies, all understood that Antigonus would not stop until he ruled everything. Their own fragmented domains could only be secured by uniting against the common threat. This was no simple border dispute. It was a final, definitive war to decide the future structure of the Hellenistic world, a choice between a single, unified empire and a system of competing but balanced states. The stage for this ultimate confrontation was the plain of Ipsus. The armies that met there in 301 BC were the largest assembled since Alexander's death, a colossal force of over 80,000 men on each side. At the heart of Antigonus's strategy was his son, Demetrius, leading a devastating cavalry charge on the wing. Demetrius smashed through the opposing horsemen, a seemingly brilliant tactical victory that should have sealed the battle. But this success was a carefully laid trap. While Demetrius and his elite cavalry were pursuing their routed foes, they were drawn dangerously far from the main battle line. This was the moment the coalition had planned for. Seleucus, who had secured a force of 500 war elephants from an Indian king, now deployed them not as a battering ram but as a mobile screen. He positioned these living fortresses between the isolated Demetrius and the central infantry battle, effectively cutting the Antigonid army in two. The aged Antigonus, standing with his phalanx, found himself suddenly exposed, his flank unprotected. The coordinated coalition forces closed in, surrounding his position. A storm of javelins rained down on the 81-year-old general, and he fell, fighting to the last for an empire that died with him. The Battle of Ipsus was a masterpiece of coalition warfare, proving that a shared fear could create a more effective alliance than any single ambition. The death of Antigonus shattered the dream of a reunified empire forever. The Hellenistic world was now permanently fractured into the three great kingdoms of the Ptolemies, Seleucids, and Antigonids, a balance of power that would define the next century. This new system demonstrated a profound political truth, that the collective interest of several rivals, however tense, could create a more durable, if competitive, stability than the absolute dominance of one. Yet this very stability, born from division, would ultimately leave them all vulnerable to a new power rising in the West, a republic that had learned to channel its internal rivalries into a terrifyingly efficient engine of expansion. A new kind of terror gripped the streets of Rome, a fear not from a foreign army but from its own. The rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla was not merely a political dispute. It was a violent schism that tore the republic in two, pitting the populist ambitions of a new man against the aristocratic privilege of the old guard. The spark was a military command against a powerful king in the east, but the fuel was a fundamental question: who truly held power in Rome, the Senate or the popular assemblies backed by loyal legions? Sulla, a patrician of immense ambition, believed the answer was the Senate. Marius, a brilliant general from outside the hereditary nobility, had built his career by appealing directly to the people and reforming the army into a force of professional soldiers loyal to their commander, not to the state. When the command Sulla believed was rightfully his was given to Marius by a tribune of the people, Sulla made a decision that shattered 5 centuries of political tradition. He turned his army, which was preparing to embark for the east, and marched it on Rome itself. For the first time in its history, the city's gates were breached not by a foreign enemy, but by Roman legions under a Roman consul. This was a point of no return. Sulla drove Marius and his supporters into exile, but his victory was temporary. The precedent was set. Military force was now a valid tool in Roman politics. Marius would return, and his revenge was swift and brutal. While Sulla was away on campaign, Marius and his allies seized the city, and his reign of terror saw the heads of his enemies displayed on spikes in the Forum. The Republic was drowning in its own blood, but Sulla was not finished. After securing his Eastern War, he returned to Italy with his veteran legions, igniting a full-scale civil war. His second march on Rome was even more terrible than the first. After crushing the remaining Marian forces in a series of pitched battles, Sulla did something unprecedented. He had himself appointed dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but for an indefinite period to reconstitute the state. His method was the proscription. He posted lists of names in the Forum, declaring those individuals enemies of the state. Their property was confiscated, their lives forfeit. Anyone could kill a proscribed man and claim a reward, while their sons and grandsons were barred from public life. It was a systematic purge designed to exterminate his political opposition and terrify the rest into submission. Thousands of Romans, from senators to wealthy equestrians, were murdered, their heads also displayed in the Forum as a grisly accounting of Sulla's power. After using absolute power to reshape the constitution to favor the Senate, Sulla then performed his most shocking act. He simply resigned. He laid down his dictatorship and retired to a private life, believing he had saved the Republic. But the norms he shattered could not be restored. The blood-soaked lesson of his career was not lost on the next generation of ambitious men. He had proven that an army's loyalty to its general was more powerful than any citizen's loyalty to the Republic. The feud between Marius and Sulla was the rehearsal for the death of the Republic, a brutal tutorial that men like Pompey, Crassus, and a young Julius Caesar watched and learned from intimately. The door to one-man rule was now open, and the next rivals to walk through it would not bother to resign. Far to the east, beyond the reach of Roman legions, a different kind of empire faced a rival it could scarcely comprehend. The Han dynasty, a marvel of centralized bureaucracy and agrarian wealth, looked out from its walled cities toward the vast, open steppes. There, the Xiongnu Confederacy moved like the wind, a nomadic civilization whose power was measured not in written decrees but in the number of its horses and the range of its mounted archers. For the Han, the Xiongnu were more than just raiders. They were a direct challenge to the emperor's mandate of heaven and his control over the lucrative Silk Road. This was a clash of two worlds, a struggle between the settled farmer and the master horseman, fought across an arena of grass and sand. The early Han emperors, humiliated by Xiongnu raids and a massive defeat that nearly captured an emperor, were forced to buy peace with a degrading policy. They sent vast quantities of silk, rice, and even Han princesses as brides to the Xiongnu Chanyu, or leader. This was appeasement, a costly tribute to keep the nomads from the gates. But this tributary relationship was a bitter pill for a civilization that saw itself as the center of the world. The shift began with the formidable Emperor Wu. He decided that the only lasting peace would come from breaking the Xiongnu's power forever. To fight a nomadic enemy, he realized he needed a nomadic-style army. The Han began a massive program to breed horses and train a new, powerful cavalry force that could meet the Xiong Nu on their own terms. The men who led this new army became legends. General Y. King, a former slave who rose to supreme command, led massive expeditions deep into the Gobi Desert, striking at the Xiong Nu heartlands with shocking speed. His most brilliant protege was his nephew, the dashing Huo Quabang. In a series of lightning campaigns, Huo Quabang perfected the art of long-range, mobile warfare. He would drive his cavalry 1,000 miles into the wilderness, living off the land, to surprise Xiong Nu camps where they felt most secure. At one pivotal battle, he reportedly seized a Xiong Nu ritual golden statue, a profound spiritual and psychological blow to the nomads. His most famous quote encapsulated the new Han aggression. When the emperor sought to reward him with a luxurious estate, the young general refused, saying, "How can I settle in a home while the Xiong Nu remain undefeated?" This relentless military pressure was only one part of the Han strategy. They also mastered the art of diplomatic warfare, using trade and alliances to isolate their enemy. They sent the explorer Zhang Qian on a monumental journey to the west, seeking an alliance with the Yuezhi people against the Xiong Nu. Though that military pact never materialized, Zhang Qian returned with something far more valuable: detailed knowledge of the Western regions, their cultures, and their goods. The Han used this intelligence to extend its influence, offering protection to the oasis city-states along the Silk Road in exchange for their loyalty, systematically cutting off the Xiong Nu from their tributary subjects and trade networks. The Han victory was not a single decisive battle, but a war of attrition fought with armies, diplomats, and merchants. The Xiong Nu Confederacy, fractured by internal strife and constant Han pressure, eventually split apart. Some factions submitted and were absorbed, while others were driven west, setting off migratory chain reactions that would eventually be felt in Europe. The Han secured the Silk Road, creating a stable corridor that would facilitate the flow of silk, spices, ideas, and technologies between East and West for centuries. This rivalry forced a great agrarian empire to become a mobile, expansionist power, proving that to defeat an unconventional enemy, you must first learn to think and fight like them. The shadow of Hannibal still loomed over Italy when Rome received a chilling message from the east. The Antigonid king of Macedon, Philip V, viewing the Republic's struggle as his own golden opportunity, had forged an alliance with the Carthaginian general. This was not a distant squabble. It was a strategic nightmare, the opening of a second front by a respected Hellenistic power at Rome's most vulnerable hour. For Philip, it was a calculated move to check the rising Italian power before it could ever threaten his own ambitions in Greece. He saw himself as the heir to Alexander's legacy, the natural leader of the Greek world, and Rome was an unwelcome barbarian meddling in his sphere of influence. The resulting conflict, the First Macedonian War, was a messy, indecisive affair fought largely by proxies, but it left a deep and bitter legacy of mutual distrust. Rome had learned a painful new truth. Its security was no longer confined to the Italian peninsula. The affairs of Greece were now inextricably linked to its own survival. When Philip continued his aggressive expansion, allying with the Seleucid king to carve up the Ptolemaic Empire's holdings, a coalition of frightened Greek city-states, including Rhodes and Pergamon, appealed to the Senate for protection. The Romans, their strength recovered after defeating Carthage, now had the perfect pretext to return to Greece not as reluctant participants, but as liberators. The Second Macedonian War had begun, and this time it would be a fight to the finish. The two armies finally met on the fog-shrouded, rolling hills of Cynoscephalae. Philip's army was built around the core of his power, the legendary Macedonian phalanx, a dense block of men carrying the massive 18-foot sarissa. This was the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander, an unstoppable wall of spear points in open terrain, but the hills of Cynoscephalae were anything but open. As the armies stumbled into each other in the thick mist, the battle began piecemeal. Philip's right wing, reaching the high ground first, managed to form up and began to push the Roman left wing down the slope, the weight of the phalanx driving all before it. It seemed the old order was about to triumph, but on the other wing, the Roman right had caught Philip's left flank while it was still disorganized and struggling to form its lines. The Roman legionaries, organized in their flexible maniples, swarmed over the disordered Macedonians. The critical moment came when a quick-thinking Roman military tribune, detached from the victorious right wing, saw the exposed flank of the successful Macedonian phalanx. On his own initiative, he led 20 maniples in a devastating charge into the side and rear of the densely packed formation. The phalangites, weighed down by their enormous spears, were helpless. They could not turn to face this new threat. It was a slaughter. The battle was a perfect demonstration of a military revolution. The rigid, magnificent phalanx, a weapon of the open plain, had been utterly dismantled by the agile, adaptable legion, a weapon for any terrain. Philip was forced to sue for peace, surrendering his fleet, his foreign possessions, and his ambitions to be the master of Greece. The rivalry between Philip V and Rome did more than just defeat a king. It marked the end of an era. Macedonian hegemony in Greece was finished forever. More importantly, it established Rome as the new arbiter of Greek politics, a reluctant but permanent imperial power in the Hellenistic East. The legions had come, and they would never truly leave. This decisive step transformed Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean superpower, its gaze now fixed on the rich, divided, and vulnerable kingdoms that Alexander's successors had left behind. The final act of the Hellenistic world was not a clash of vast armies, but a deeply personal and theatrical struggle for its very soul. On one side stood Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a ruler of immense intellect and political cunning who saw her kingdom's only hope in a strategic alliance with powerful Romans. Her partner was Mark Antony, a charismatic but flawed general, one of the three men vying for control of the Roman world after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Arrayed against them was Octavian, Julius Caesar's cold, calculating adopted son, a man who understood the power of public perception better than anyone. For Cleopatra, this was a battle to preserve her dynasty and her nation's independence. For Octavian, it was a fight to eliminate his last rival and seize absolute power. He masterfully reframed this Roman civil war not as a political contest, but as a cosmic struggle. He portrayed Antony as a drunken, effeminate puppet, seduced and corrupted by a decadent Eastern queen who threatened to move the capital of Rome to Alexandria. This was not just politics, it was a propaganda war, and Octavian was its undisputed master. The decisive confrontation came not on land, but at sea, near the promontory of Actium in Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, though large, was plagued by disease and desertion. Their ships were heavier, designed for boarding actions, while Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was composed of lighter, faster vessels. As the two fleets engaged, the battle descended into a chaotic melee of grappling hooks and flaming arrows. But the turning point was not a spectacular naval maneuver. At the height of the fighting, Cleopatra, stationed behind the lines with her squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, suddenly raised her sails and broke through the center of the action, heading for the open sea. Antony, seeing her flee, abandoned his own men and followed. Their escape sealed their fate and the fate of their cause. The rest of their fleet, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. Why would two seasoned commanders abandon their entire army and navy? The act has been debated for 2,000 years. It was likely a prearranged, if desperate, plan to salvage their war chest and regroup in Egypt for a final stand. But in the court of public opinion, it was a catastrophic failure. Octavian's propaganda machine spun it as proof of Antony's enslaved will and Cleopatra's cowardice. The following year, Octavian pursued them to Egypt. Facing certain defeat and capture, Antony, fed a false report of Cleopatra's death, fell on his own sword. The legendary queen, determined to deny Octavian the ultimate humiliation of parading her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, took her own life, reportedly by the bite of an asp, a serpent sacred to the Egyptian pharaohs. With her death, the 300-year-old Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt, the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, was annexed as a personal province of Octavian, its vast grain reserves now fueling the Roman state. The rivalry between Cleopatra and Octavian was the final, dramatic curtain call for the Hellenistic Age. It erased the last major independent kingdom born from Alexander's empire and cleared the stage completely for the new era of the Roman Empire, with Octavian soon to become Augustus Caesar, its first true emperor. The personal ambitions of a queen and the cold calculation of an emperor had forever altered the map of power, but this new Roman world, now unified under one man, would soon discover that its greatest threats were no longer foreign kings or rival generals, but the internal pressures of its own colossal size. The wealth of Crassus was a legend in Rome, a fortune built on fire and property speculation that made him the richest man in the Republic. Yet for all his gold, he craved the one thing it could not easily buy: the military glory enjoyed by his rivals Pompey and Caesar. His ambition drew him east to the fledgling Parthian Empire, a power Rome understood little about. He envisioned a quick, lucrative campaign that would finally secure his legacy, leading 7 legions, over 40,000 men, into the Mesopotamian desert. He was not marching toward glory, but into a meticulously laid trap. Waiting for him was a general named Shapur, a man whose genius lay in understanding his enemy's fatal arrogance. The Parthian army was nothing like the rigid legions Crassus commanded. It was a fluid, lethal instrument built around 2 components, the horse archer and the cataphract. The archers were the swarm, light cavalry that could unleash a storm of arrows from a distance. The cataphracts were the hammer, heavily armored knights on armored horses, wielding long lances that could punch through any formation. This was the ultimate clash of doctrines, the Roman infantry square against a whirlwind of steel and horseflesh. Shapur deliberately lured Crassus deeper into the waterless, flat plain near Carrhae, a landscape that perfectly favored his mobile forces. When the Roman scouts reported a small Parthian force, Crassus formed his men into a large, defensive square, expecting a traditional pitched battle. He was utterly unprepared for what happened next. The main Parthian army appeared not as a solid line, but as a shimmering, mobile cloud. Their cataphracts, covered head to toe in scale armor that glittered in the sun, formed a terrifying front. But it was the horse archers who began the destruction. They swept in, released volleys of arrows from outside the range of Roman javelins, and then wheeled away before the legionaries could engage. The Romans were like a tortoise besieged by wasps, their heavy shields offering some protection, but the constant, withering fire began to pin them in place. Crassus sent his son Publius on a desperate charge with the Gallic cavalry to drive the archers off. It was exactly what Shapur had hoped for. The Parthians feigned retreat, drawing the impetuous Publius and his men far from the main square. Then the trap snapped shut. The cataphracts turned and charged, their heavy lances shattering the lighter Gallic horsemen. Publius and his entire command were surrounded and annihilated. Back in the main square, the Romans watched in horror as a Parthian rider galloped up and hurled the head of Publius Crassus toward their lines. The psychological blow was as devastating as the arrows. The battle became a slow, methodical slaughter under the relentless sun. The Parthians, with a train of 1,000 camels carrying endless reserves of arrows, never ran out of ammunition. The Romans, packed together, were systematically shot to pieces. Any attempt to advance was met with a wall of cataphracts. Any attempt to hold formation meant dying slowly from 1,000 cuts. That night, the broken remnants of the army tried to retreat, but the Parthians hunted them down. Crassus was killed during a treacherous parley, and legend says the Parthians, in a final act of symbolic vengeance, poured molten gold down his throat, a mockery of his famed wealth. The legionary standards, the sacred eagles that represented the pride and soul of the legions, were captured. The Battle of Carrhae was more than a defeat. It was a systemic humiliation that checked Roman expansion eastward for centuries. It proved that the legion, for all its discipline and might, was dangerously vulnerable to a technologically and tactically superior enemy it could not bring to close combat. The rivalry between the ambitious Crassus and the brilliant Shauna established the Euphrates River as a permanent, contested frontier, creating a balance of power that would define the ancient world for the next 300 years. It was a stark lesson that gold could raise an army, but only innovation and adaptability could make it victorious. The same legions that had crushed the Parthian cataphracts at Carrhae would soon face a different kind of enemy, one whose battlefield was not the open desert but the human spirit. In the rocky highlands of Judea, the Roman Empire encountered a resistance it could not comprehend, a people for whom freedom was a divine command. This was not a rivalry of kings or generals, but a colossal clash between the world's most powerful military state and a small province animated by an unbreakable faith. The Jewish Revolts were born from a toxic combination of religious intolerance, heavy-handed taxation, and a deep cultural contempt from their Roman overlords. For the Jewish people, whose identity was inextricably linked to their one God and the sanctity of the temple in Jerusalem, Roman demands to worship the emperor as a deity were not just political slights. They were blasphemy, an existential threat that demanded defiance. The Great Revolt erupted in the year 66, a firestorm of pent-up fury against decades of corruption and sacrilege. Jewish zealots initially scored stunning successes, driving the Roman garrison from Jerusalem and humiliating the empire's local allies, but Rome's response was swift and terrifyingly methodical. The Emperor Vespasian, and later his son Titus, marched 4 legions into Judea, systematically reducing fortified towns and villages one by one. The war culminated in a grueling siege of Jerusalem itself. For months, the city endured unimaginable horrors, its streets torn by internal factional fighting, even as the Roman battering rams pounded the outer walls. The final blow fell upon the Temple Mount. Despite later claims that Titus ordered its preservation, the heart of Jewish worship was set ablaze and utterly destroyed. The sight of the temple in flames, the center of their spiritual universe reduced to rubble, was a trauma that would echo for millennia. The legions slaughtered or enslaved tens of thousands, and the victory was commemorated in Rome with the iconic Arch of Titus, which still depicts the looted treasures of the temple, including the sacred menorah. Yet, even this catastrophic defeat could not extinguish the longing for freedom. 60 years later, a second, even more desperate rebellion flared. Led by the charismatic Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many believed to be the Messiah, the Jewish fighters employed brilliant guerrilla tactics, using hidden cave complexes in the Judean desert to launch devastating ambushes. For 3 years they stunned the Romans, even managing to re-establish an independent state and mint their own coins. The empire, under Emperor Hadrian, was forced to commit a massive force, pulling legions from other frontiers to crush the uprising. The Roman retaliation was absolute. Ancient historians recount the staggering scale of the slaughter, with hundreds of thousands killed and Judea itself virtually emptied of its Jewish population. Hadrian went further, building a new Roman city, Aelia Capitolina, on the ruins of Jerusalem and banning Jews from entering it. He even renamed the province Syria Palestina, a deliberate attempt to sever the land's connection to the Jewish people. The Bar Kokhba revolt was the final, tragic act. It solidified the Jewish diaspora, scattering communities across the Mediterranean and beyond. These conflicts forced a profound transformation within Judaism, shifting its center from temple ritual to rabbinic teaching and the study of the Torah in local synagogues. Simultaneously, the destruction of the temple and the separation of the early Jesus movement from its Jewish roots were pivotal in the development of a distinct Christianity. The Jewish revolts stand as a somber testament to the limits of raw power. Rome could destroy a temple, scatter a people, and rename a land, but it could never conquer the faith that gave a nation its soul. This pattern of an empire struggling to control a fiercely independent culture would soon repeat itself in a distant, misty land at the very edge of the known world. The capture of a Roman emperor was an event so unthinkable it shattered the very foundation of imperial prestige. Yet that is precisely what Shapur I, the king of kings of the resurgent Sasanian Empire, achieved. He did not merely defeat Rome, he systematically humiliated it, crafting a legend of Persian supremacy that would echo for centuries. His rivalry was not with one emperor, but with 3, and his victories were a declaration that the East was no longer Rome's to dominate. The first to fall was the young Gordian III. Leading a massive army to avenge earlier Persian incursions, Gordian met Shapur in a brutal battle at Mesik. The Roman force was shattered, and Gordian himself died there, though whether in combat or by the hands of his own frustrated officers remains a subject of debate. Shapur, however, claimed the kill, the first emperor to fall against a Persian enemy. The next to face Shapur's might was Philip the Arab, the man who likely succeeded Gordian. Philip had no choice but to negotiate, and the terms were devastating. He was forced to pay a colossal ransom, concede that Armenia was within Persia's sphere of influence, and perhaps most humiliating of all, he agreed to pay tribute to Shapur, a public admission of Roman subordination. But the crowning achievement, the event that stunned the ancient world, was still to come. The Emperor Valerian, leading another vast army to restore Roman honor, was outmaneuvered and surrounded at Edessa. With his army ravaged by plague and trapped, Valerian sought a personal parley with Shapur. It was a trap. The emperor was seized, taken prisoner, and led away in chains. For the rest of his life, he remained a captive of the Persian court, a living trophy. The psychological impact on the Roman world was catastrophic. The invincible facade of the empire was broken. How could the gods favor Rome when its supreme ruler was a slave in a foreign land? Shapur ensured this narrative would be set in stone, quite literally. At the sacred site of Naksh-e-Rostam, he commissioned monumental rock reliefs depicting his triumphs. In one breathtaking panel, Shapur sits majestically on his horse, while a kneeling Valerian, his hands outstretched, begs for mercy. Another shows the Roman Emperor Philip humbly submitting before the Persian king. These were not hidden records. They were public propaganda carved into the living rock for all travelers and diplomats to see, a permanent, undeniable testament to the day Persia held Rome by the throat. The rivalry between Shapur and these 3 emperors was far more than a series of battles. It announced the arrival of the Sasanian Empire as a true peer and existential threat to Rome, a centralized Zoroastrian state brimming with martial pride and imperial ambition. This was not the fading Parthian kingdom the legions had known. This was a resurgent Persia that would lock the Roman, and later the Byzantine, empire into a 400-year struggle for control of the world, a clash of titans that would define the late antique era and exhaust both powers just as a new force was gathering in the Arabian deserts. At the very edge of the Hellenistic world, where Alexander's legacy stretched its final, tenuous fingers, stood the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Isolated by vast mountain ranges and deserts, this was a civilization of profound contradiction, a glittering island of Greek philosophy and theater surrounded by an endless sea of grass. For over a century, its rulers held court in magnificent cities like Ai Khanum, a metropolis boasting a gymnasium, a library, and a theater that could seat thousands, all overlooking the Oxus River. Here, Greek plays were performed for an audience that also included local Bactrian nobles and traders from India. This was not just a colony, it was a fusion, an experiment in civilization at the very frontier. Yet this cultural brilliance was perpetually shadowed by a relentless threat from the northern steppes. The kingdom's immense wealth, derived from controlling critical segments of the Silk Road, was its greatest strength and its most dangerous liability. That same trade route, a conduit for silk and spices, also served as a highway for nomadic confederations like the Saka and the Yuezhi, drawn by the promise of plunder. The rivalry here was not for glory or a single throne, but for sheer survival. How does a settled, urban society defend itself against an enemy that has no cities to besiege, no fixed fields to burn, an enemy that can simply melt back into the steppe? The kings of Bactria answered with a network of fortified outposts and a powerful, hybrid army of Greek phalangites and Iranian cavalry. They became masters of a permanent, low-intensity war, a constant state of vigilance against raids that could escalate into full-scale invasion at any moment. The archaeological remains of Ai Khanum tell a story of a society both confident and deeply anxious. Its walls are massively thick, its acropolis heavily fortified. A citizen could discuss Aristotle in the morning and man the battlements in the afternoon. For a time, this balance held. The Greco-Bactrians even expanded their influence, pushing into northern India and creating a legacy of Indo-Greek art that would last for centuries. But the pressure from the steppe was unceasing, a domino effect of tribal migrations, set in motion by conflicts far to the east, began to push the Yuezhi Confederation westward. This was not an army to be defeated in a single, decisive battle. It was a slow, tectonic force, a human tide that tested the kingdom's defenses year after year. The end did not come from a single failed battle, but from a gradual erosion. The constant warfare drained the royal treasury and stretched the military to its limits. Internal divisions may have fractured their resolve. Eventually, the defenses crumbled. Ai Khanum was sacked and abandoned, its libraries burned, its statues defiled. The Yuezhi overran the land not to rule the cities but to occupy the pastures. The light of Greek civilization on the Central Asian frontier was snuffed out. This final struggle underscores a brutal historical truth. A state can be culturally vibrant, economically prosperous, and militarily adept, yet still be swept away by persistent, overwhelming external pressure. The very trade routes that built the Greco-Bactrian kingdom became the instrument of its downfall, illustrating the double-edged nature of global connectivity. Their story is a poignant reminder that on the fragile frontiers of empire, the greatest rival is often not another civilization, but the relentless, impersonal force of change itself. A queen's humiliation ignited a firestorm across the damp mists of Britannia. When Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe, died, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping this act of diplomacy would secure his family's position. Rome's response was not gratitude but a brutal annexation. Roman officials flogged his widow, Boudica, and raped her young daughters, an act of calculated cruelty designed to shatter the tribe's spirit. Instead, it forged a weapon of vengeance. Boudica united the Iceni with the neighboring Trinovantes, their shared hatred for Roman rule boiling over into a full-scale rebellion. This was not a war of conquest, but a righteous fury aimed at driving the invaders into the sea. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far to the west, campaigning on the island of Mona, a Druid stronghold. In his absence, the province was virtually undefended. Boudica's forces fell upon the Roman settlements like a force of nature. The veteran colony of Camulogenum was first. Its inhabitants, retired legionaries and their families, begged the imperial agent for help, but only 200 poorly armed men were sent. The city was overwhelmed and systematically torn down, its temple becoming a final, burning tomb for those trapped inside. The rebellion then swept south toward Londinium. Though not yet the great city it would become, it was a thriving trading port. Suetonius, racing back from his campaign, made a cold calculation. He could not defend it. He abandoned Londinium to its fate, urging those who could to flee with his army. Boudica's warriors burned the settlement to the ground, slaughtering anyone who remained. The same fiery destruction was visited upon Verulamium. The ashes of 3 cities testified to the depth of the rebels' rage and the totality of their initial success. But Suetonius was a seasoned commander, and he was patiently choosing his ground. He assembled his outnumbered force, the 14th Legion, elements of the 20th, and whatever auxiliaries were at hand, perhaps 10,000 men in total. He positioned them in a narrow defile with dense woods protecting his rear and flanks. This funnel forced the massive British horde, which ancient sources claim numbered in the hundreds of thousands, to attack his disciplined lines head-on. The Britons, confident in their overwhelming numbers, crowded into the field with their families watching from wagons at the edge, expecting to see a rout. What they witnessed was a masterclass in Roman military doctrine. As the Britons charged, the Romans held their position, unleashing a volley of javelins that sowed chaos in the packed ranks. Then they advanced in a tight, wedge-shaped formation, their short swords cutting down the lightly armored warriors who could not stand against their armor and training. The very size of the British force became its greatest weakness. Those in the rear pressed forward, trapping those in the front against the Roman wall of shields. It became a slaughter. The Romans cut their way through the crowd with mechanical efficiency. The British wagons, meant to be a grandstand, became a barrier, and as the Romans broke through, the retreat became a massacre. Tacitus records that nearly 80,000 Britons fell, compared to only 400 Romans. Boudica, according to tradition, took poison to avoid capture. Her rebellion was extinguished, but its echo would never fade. In the aftermath, the Romans, shaken by how close they had come to losing the entire province, replaced the corrupt procurator and adopted a more conciliatory administrative policy. Boudica's defeat on the battlefield was absolute, yet her name was transformed into a timeless symbol of defiance. She proved that the cost of occupation could be terrifyingly high, and that even a crushed rival could force an empire to change its ways. These 22 rivalries, spanning continents and centuries, reveal a startling truth about power. The same fundamental patterns repeat themselves, as if history is trapped in an endless cycle of ambition and consequence. Personal grudges consistently proved more potent than abstract political goals. the burning hatred between a Sulla and a Marius, or the obsessive pursuit of Darius by Alexander, reshaped governments and erased borders far more decisively than any cold policy document. Time and again, the fate of millions was decided by the wounded pride of a single ruler. Alongside this, human ego, technological and tactical innovation acted as the great equalizer. The Roman Manipular Legion, born from the shame of the Caudine Forks, overcame the mighty Macedonian phalanx. The Parthian horse archer and cataphract, a combined arms system perfected at Carrhae, humbled the seemingly invincible Roman legions. Victory rarely went to the side with the most resources, but to the one that could most effectively rewrite the rules of war itself, and underpinning it all was the relentless engine of cultural clash. The settled Han dynasty was forced to master nomadic cavalry to survive the Xiongnu. Rome's attempt to impose its gods on Judea sparked a rebellion of the spirit that no legion could ever fully extinguish. These were not just fights for land, but for a way of life, for the right to define reality. The consequences of these struggles established the very templates of empire. Sargon of Akkad created the blueprint for centralized rule, a model of conquest and population control that every subsequent empire would follow. The peace treaty between the Hittites and Egyptians demonstrated that even bitter rivals could find more strength in a negotiated stability than in perpetual war. And the utter destruction of Carthage by Rome set a terrifying precedent for total annihilation, a doctrine that would echo through the ages. From these ancient conflicts, we can distill timeless lessons. The overextension of Athens in Sicily, the isolation of Hannibal in Italy, and the exhausting grind of the Syrian Wars all teach the same thing: that ambition unchecked by practical limits is a prelude to disaster. The importance of allies was another constant, with the Grand Coalition at Ipsus proving that shared fear could topple even the most powerful single ambition. And always there was the unpredictable role of chance, a sudden plague, a traitor's blade, or a king's moment of cowardice that could tilt the scales of history in an instant. The echoes of these ancient power struggles are not silent. The geopolitical chessboard of today, with its shifting alliances, trade wars, and cultural tensions, operates on a stage built thousands of years ago. The same dangers of imperial overreach, the same strategic value of controlling trade routes, and the same explosive power of a cultural or religious insult remain potent forces. To understand the rivalries that shape our modern world, we need only to listen to the whispers carried on the dust of Kadesh, Carrhae, and Actium, for the patterns of power are humanity's oldest story. From the first imperial conquests of Sargon to the defiant stand of Boudicca, the rivalries we have explored were not mere footnotes in history. They were the very engines that drove it forward, forging and breaking empires in their wake. These 22 conflicts remind us that history is shaped by the complex and often messy interplay of human ambition, brilliant strategy, and unpredictable circumstance. We see how a single decision, born from pride or fear, could redirect the course of civilization for centuries. They teach us about the deeply cyclical nature of power, the rise and fall that seems almost inevitable, and the enduring human drive to carve a name that will echo through the ages. The quest for legacy, to be remembered as a god-king like Rameses or a liberator like Scipio, was often a more powerful motivator than the simple accumulation of territory or gold. As we look back on these ancient struggles, from the sun-baked plains of Kadesh to the misty fields of Britannia, we are not just observing a distant past. We are being encouraged to see the underlying patterns that continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of our world today. The same tensions between established powers and rising challengers, the same strategic importance of trade routes, and the same explosive potential of cultural and ideological clashes are all themes that resonate across the millennia. If you found this journey through the power struggles of the ancient world fascinating, please subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these 22 rivalries did you find most compelling and why?